And Reza Pahlavi is, they actually make jokes about him and his family. Some of the people that I interviewed, I mean, I'd like to say this quite openly, is I'm not sure if I can say it on your platform, but he is actually a piece of shit.
Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Halper.
I'm Aaron Maté. Thank you so much for being here. Our website is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. This week, we'll be bringing you two different interviews. We'll be speaking to Bushra Shaikh. She is an independent journalist based in the UK who is just back from Iran and got to see for herself what it is like there as Trump threatens another regime change war in the Middle East, ordering the largest U.S. military deployment since the Iraq War. So we'll hear from Bushra about what it was like on the ground inside Tehran. And we'll be talking about the late Jesse Jackson, the civil rights leader who passed away, who revolutionized politics in so many ways. Pick an issue, and Jesse Jackson was at the forefront of fighting for it, including Palestine. Before any national prominent politician in the U.S., Jesse Jackson was speaking about Palestinian rights and took a lot of heat from that, especially from his own party, the Democratic Party.
And for that, we'll be speaking to two of his comrades, Albert McIver and Eric Easter.
All right, every week we do a recap of the week. It's called the Friday Free For All. It's for our paid subscribers, but if you're a free subscriber, here's a preview. And what could be madder than a gathering of Trump's so-called Board of Peace in Washington? All the heavy hitters were there, including Tony Blair, the guy who helped George W. Bush destroy Iraq in the Middle East. Now he's on the Board of Peace, along with Israel. Why not, right? So here's Jared Kushner, the guy who doesn't even have an official government position under Trump, but happens to be Trump's son-in-law. So he gets to decide the fate of the biggest geopolitical crises in the world, from the Russia-Ukraine war to Iran to Gaza. And he wants you to know that, yes, sure, he's a very wealthy person. He's surrounded by wealthy people. He takes money from his private equity firm, from governments like Saudi Arabia, and Trump's digital currency company takes a huge stake, billions of dollars from the UAE. But don't worry, nothing untoward is going on here. No one's going to make any money off of erasing Gaza's culture and turning it into a dystopian casino on the Mediterranean.
What you've seen today is just a small sample of the work that's been done. And I really want to thank the entire team that's worked so hard at this. A lot of these people are volunteers. They're doing this not for any personal gain. People are not personally profiting from this. They are really doing this for their children and for their grandchildren, and because they want to see peace.
So some people volunteer at the local food pantry, right? Or to go, shovel snow off the sidewalk. Other people volunteer to erase Gaza's history, put its remaining population, those who haven't been expelled or killed, under a Orwellian surveillance system, out of the goodness of their heart.
Yeah, I mean, he is acting on behalf of the children and his children, because I'm sure that his children will appreciate inheriting some prime real estate on the Gaza Riviera.
And meanwhile, at the so-called Board of Peace meeting, Trump kicked it off by basically saying, we might go to war with Iran. So stay tuned for that. Great way to kick off your Board of Peace meeting, by threatening to go to war. And how are Democrats pushing back on Trump ordering the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the Iraq War, at least 2 aircraft carriers, dozens of fighter jets, air defenses, all sorts of command and control centers? How are Democrats pushing back? Well, let's take a listen to Democratic Senator Mark Warner.
The notion that I understand that some supporters of the administration are saying, well, it's just going to be us and Israel alone. That's not the best plan, particularly since when the Iranians tried to strike back against Israel earlier in the year or last year, it was literally, it was us, the Israelis, but it was also the British, the French, the Jordanians who helped that as well. Yeah. If we don't bring in our allies, any military strike, and the president should keep all the options on the table. And Lord knows we'd like the negotiations to work, but America alone is not the strongest that we could be and should be.
Well, it's cool you throw in at least some mention of negotiations working. I mean, that was kind of him to throw in a throwaway line like, yeah, we hope the negotiations work, as he's giving Trump advice on how a more effective U.S. military attack would go by including more people.
He's really embracing cooperation and collaboration. Stop, collaborate, and listen, we're going to bomb Iran into a new position. You're welcome, everyone. I just came up with that. You may have thought that I spent all night preparing that, but I just did come up with that. Yeah. So he's more into a collaborative approach when it comes to bombing Iran, I guess. He wants to bring in the allies. Yeah.
And it's so fitting because, you know, back in 2003, when all the Democrats lined up to support George W. Bush with some honorable exceptions, their main critique after the invasion started going badly was like, well, we didn't go in with enough equipment, with enough of a coalition. That was John Kerry's line when he ran against Bush in 2004. So Democrats are kind of doing a flashback here. It's a very retro time, you know, another Middle East buildup and another just pathetic Democratic response.
You know, I want to give Warner a shout out for a couple weeks ago. We covered this on Monday Morning. He did say he was upset about the missed opportunities in Iran because we couldn't strike because the aircraft carrier that was usually in the Mediterranean was off the coast of Venezuela during the blockade there. So he, again, is someone, he's a real creative thinker, and he always laments, war potential being squandered. And again, hopefully we can just work with more allies and make sure that we coordinate. So we're kidnapping leaders like Maduro. We spread it out. So we're kidnapping them like a couple months ahead of time and not at the same time as we need to regime change Iran. Got
to plan better for regime change.
Plan better, yeah.
Which includes getting more people involved and also not doing too many regime changes at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah, stagger.
All right, let's hear from another Democratic voice. This is Brett McGurk. He served as a senior Middle East official under Obama and Biden. And there are very few people who served under Obama who are still willing to say, hey, why doesn't Trump just go back to the Iran nuclear deal that Obama brokered, that like our administration brokered, that was working and had solved the issue of Iran's nuclear program? No one is willing to say that, including Brett McGurk, who is on board with the Trump threat to bomb Iran. And here's why.
And to see the full Friday Fear for All, where we talk about Mike Huckabee's fears and Donald Trump's crushes, go to usefulidiots.podcast.com. Just think about all the private things you've typed into ChatGPT, late night questions, business ideas, even sensitive personal struggles. How would it feel if those conversations weren't private? For us, these questions about the safety of AI have become dramatically more pressing in the past year alone, which is why we want to share with you this week's sponsor, Venice AI. We think it makes sense to hesitate using AI until you have privacy clarity and legal clarity. We're asking questions like, why does ChatGPT have the former director of the NSA sitting on its board? That's where Venice AI comes in. I use Venice to run leading open source AI models directly in my browser. My conversations are encrypted and stored only on my device, so no corporation or government can spy on me, censor me, or use my data for a profit. Using AI can help with content creation, information retrieval, personal assistance, coding, and so much more. But we shouldn't have to risk our privacy to use it. If you want to use AI without handing your most personal information to corporations or the government, check out venice.ai. Get 20% off a pro plan at venice.ai/useful with code useful. That's venice.ai/useful with code useful.
As Donald Trump orders the largest U.S. military buildup since the Iraq War, what is the mood right now inside Iran? Well, to get a gauge of that, we spoke to Bushra Shaikh. She is a journalist, broadcaster who is based in the UK, and she was just in Tehran seeing for herself what it is like amidst the threat of a new regime change war by the U.S. Bushra Shaikh, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for having me on.
You just came back from Iran. You went a little bit viral with some of your reporting there. Talk to us first about your impressions, the difference between what you saw on the ground and the picture that we get here in NATO state media about what's happening inside of Iran.
Well, the difference is really stark. I mean, for me, it was my first time going to Iran, and I actually really wanted to go during this time. But everything that is fed in the West is a concocted narrative, which doesn't really depict Iran in its true, in the true way. And I just found it crazy because going there and just speaking to locals, which I actually got the opportunity to do, and lots of them, in fact, people are just going about their daily lives. It's, yes, the riots happened, there were protests, but actually what is being spoon-fed to the Western public does not at all represent what's happening on the ground there.
And what do you think is happening on the ground?
What's happening on the ground there is you have a large community at the moment who are widely very worried about the prospect of a war, of being illegally attacked in their country. Actually, one of their main concerns that a lot of people spoke about were the sanctions. One of the main things that they speak about there is, well, actually, we just want to live good lives and we want to prosper and we want to be able to enhance our economy, build good ties with other countries, and these sanctions need to be lifted. So most of people's real concerns were sanctions, and it wasn't changing who's in charge of their country.
And in terms of the impact of sanctions on people's daily lives at the granular level, did you pick up any examples of how these sanctions just interfere with the functions of daily life and make it more difficult?
Yeah, totally. I mean, whilst I was really happy with the way Iran looked, I mean, I was in the city of Tehran, and parts of northern Tehran and southern Tehran, have really good infrastructure. But one thing I was told by lots of people is, Bushra, you should have really have come here maybe 5 or 10 years ago, because it was even better than it looks now. So sanctions have really had an implication on the way the infrastructure is. They haven't really been able to build as widely as they would like to. People's lives in terms of how much they're getting paid, how much things are costing. It's very, very hard for them to live at the moment. They are paying extortionate prices for basic goods that even us in the West, where we complain about the way, inflation works and affects just going and buying like a loaf of bread, for them, it's really tricky. But on the flip side of that, people that have been sanctioned so hard still remain and have this positivity about their country. And that's what I found absolutely remarkable.
So let's go to a clip of Nancy Pelosi. She is a Democratic leader. She was recently speaking at the Munich Security Conference, and she spoke about the impact of the sanctions, which she supports. And she says one goal of the sanctions should be to hurt Iranians who support their government.
Is there a way to sort of bring about the regime fallen without using American force, I guess is the question there?
Well, use economic forces.
Yeah.
Use economic forces. There are ways that cripple their economy, and some of that has been in the works.
It does feel very tenuous, though, the regime there, more than it has in a long time.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you. But again, it's not about a threat from war. Hopefully, it's more about just make their economy, weaken their economy, and that weakens the support they do have. Because they do have support in the rural areas and the more conservative imams and all the rest of that. Yeah. But we have to make them feel the pain as well.
So this is what passes for the opposition in the U.S. Regime change by force, maybe not, but definitely let's make ordinary people feel pain if they happen to support the government that we want to overthrow.
That's really interesting by Nancy Pelosi, and I've heard something like that before. You see, with the Iranians, it's very different because this has actually backfired. Like applying economic pressure by these sanctions is actually doing the opposite of what the US government, I guess, want to happen. This is actually making people rally around their flag. Iranian society is very, how would I describe it? They're all connected through the faith of Islam. Now, I know that Iran is so different across the board, and you've got Muslims, you've got non-Muslims that live there, you've got minority communities, you've got all different ethnicities on every single border part of Iran. But the majority of people I spoke to, they are devout Muslims. So their society is actually Islamic. So they support the people in charge because of their religion. So applying these sanctions in a way to try and want people to uprise against their government is actually doing the opposite. They actually dislike the US and the West more because they're seeing that actually these sanctions have nothing to do with the people in charge, but in fact, the people that are like across the ponds that are doing this to them.
You went to a rally and went a little bit viral with this clip because you were not wearing hijab. And for a lot of people, this cut against the impression they have of what Iran is like, where there's still a widespread belief that, that the law is enforced of the hijab being mandatory. Let's watch this clip.
What's amazing, guys, is I have walked this entire rally in the middle of Iran without a hijab on. I know what loads of you are thinking. You're thinking, how is she in the middle of Tehran at that square without her scarf on? Nothing has happened to me. Nobody has abused me. Nobody has said anything. In fact, when you are a visitor in Iran, they treat you so well, even me, without a hijab. But it's the fact that I have come here, I have been welcomed, and nobody has said a single thing to me about my hair being uncovered.
That got a lot of attention. Your critics say this was a misleading picture, that you were allowed to do this because you're a foreigner and you have a big platform. Talk to us about what it was like and the reaction that you saw online to this clip.
Well, what's interesting is that you could just go on Google and you can go on YouTube. Plenty of tourists that go to Iran who don't actually wear the hijab. So there are hundreds of videos available of tourists going into Iran without the hijab on and just filming for themselves. So this idea that I was part of some kind of group and I was given privileges that other people wouldn't is crazy to do. And just to be able to speak to the fact that whilst hijab is still law in Iran, there is 100% this softness around it. I saw hundreds of women, and I mean, there was one evening I went into the marketplace, and I'd say 50% of the women were not wearing hijab. They were walking their dogs, because as far as I'm aware, there's also a problem with walking dogs in Iran, but people were walking their dogs. So this picture that's kind of created in the West, I believe, is more of a very old school type of Iran. And there is a movement in Iran that is taking shape. And I think that's what's not being heard. And it's purposely being kind of censored from the West. I was walking in that rally. It was such an amazing place to be in because there were hundreds of thousands of people coming out in support of their government, of the leadership, with their families. I was there without a hijab on, and honestly, it was just one of those experiences that I thought I would never have. And given even some of the propaganda that I call it in the West, I was even confused because when I got there, I was like, Bushra, actually, you've kind of been propagandized a little bit from what I was listening to and what I was reading. So having that experience for myself really was an eye-opener for myself.
What else was different in terms of your impression before coming in and then what you saw on the ground?
Oh gosh, I don't even know where to start. It's like, I'm just dumbfounded at how much misinformation and propaganda there is in the West about Iran itself. Look, I'm not here to defend any government. I don't have a horse in this race. I live in the UK. But what I like to do is I like to present different perspectives that do exist. And Iranian society it's special. They sincerely love their country. They also love Islam. Like in Iran, there really isn't this contrast that we're seeing here in the West, where people are anti-Islam. Like that just doesn't exist. Not in the places that I was. People genuinely don't want war. They really do have an affinity to multiculturalism. Like there's so many ethnicities in Iran. They speak multiple languages. Most Iranians that I met were like, they could speak more than 3 languages because that's how vast it is in Iran. Like you need to know different languages. And these are not people that are saying that, we are being ruled by tyrants. They're not people that are saying, we want foreign interference in our country. In fact, it's the complete opposite of that. And this narrative is predominantly coming from the diaspora in the West, most of whom haven't been back to Iran, probably never been to Iran. So even their perspective is shaped by what gets told to them in the media over here.
But some of those people might say, well, we're not allowed to go back to Iran because of their repressive government. What would you say to them who say, those people who don't want foreign intervention, but still have a desire for change inside their government and feel maybe caught between regime change threats by the West and what they see as the repressive nature of the Iranian government?
Well, I mean, what I'd say to them is, yes, there's a huge population that want to go back to Iran or want to visit Iran and maybe aren't allowed to do so. I think a lot of that is because they have been quite vocally anti-Iran, maybe not anti-government, but like anti-Iran, or perhaps because one thing I do know is with the Iranians I spoke there is they refuse to want anyone in their country that's going to cause havoc and mayhem. Like they've just seen one of the biggest bloodbaths since they've probably been alive, and they are still mourning what's just happened in their country. And that they become fearful because they're like, well, if people who don't want to create harmony in this country come here and cause problems like that, then, people's lives obviously get lost in the end. But even inside of Iran, there are people on the fringes, I'd say. It's not a big kind of majority, but there is still a public opinion where they do want to have change in their leadership. By all means, that does absolutely exist. But then at the same time, not only do they have the spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, they've also got the president. And he normally acts as the kind of intermediary that has this kind of progressive change. So he's there to kind of speak for those voices that might say, well, we don't fully agree, with some of your policies in this country. And he's kind of there to help shape that. And having some of the conversations that I did, not only with the Iranian public, but with some serious high ministers, there is this sense of change that's happening. Their leadership are fully aware of some of the policy changes that they would like to perhaps touch on and adapt. But the problem is that we don't really get to see that side of the politics in Iran.
Especially when it's constantly under threat of military force and under sanctions that make normal life impossible, as they're designed to do. When it comes to those protests, we've gotten so much propaganda here, claims of tens of thousands of people killed by the government and its crackdown. What did you learn about what actually happened on the ground?
Wow. What I learned was that these were protests, and they were completely legitimate. They were allowed by the government, and the government were totally happy to have the Bazaris doing their protests. They were aware of the unions doing this. Actually, the police were there. And the officers were enforced around the protest to make sure that it could happen. They weren't there to stop anything. But ultimately, these protests were hijacked. I met numerous families, and this wasn't just like an arranged group thing that I had to go to. Like I sought out families that I really wanted to speak to, that I knew from online that had experienced what had happened. And there was all sorts of things happening where they were like, people were being used as human shields. So like protesters were being used as human shield by other protesters that had from somewhere had been armed. So they had guns, they had axes, they had batons. Like this was like something that didn't randomly, organically happen. It definitely felt like, from what they were saying, was pre-planned, was already existing there. And this was a perfect moment for them to strike. So a lot of the Iranian innocent civilians were caught in this crossfire and were actually killed by fellow Iranians, which I would probably describe as kind of somewhat terrorists, because that's what terrorists do. They don't care who they kill. Like there was one couple, husband and wife, and the wife ended up getting killed, but he's still alive. And that was one of the most heartbreaking stories. He said that the besieged forces were actually behind the riots. So he knew that they were behind him, and his wife, who was slightly ahead of him, was shot in the head, but was shot from the front where there were no officers. So that's one example to say that you had armed foreign-backed rioters in the midst of what changed into riots from protests, who were just killing innocent people to get the numbers up. And this atrocity propaganda number of 30,000, 40,000, I think someone even said it was 700,000 to me, which is ridiculous. It's just crazy, because there are, I've even said to people, how about you give me all the names of the 30,000 people that you are saying that are being killed? Because I could provide you the names of 3,117. And even then, the government of Iran has said, if anybody is missing, then please do reach out, because we will help you track and find these people. So this idea that they've created in the West, where they're trying to hide numbers and body counts, is completely fabricated.
The son of the ousted Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, he is presented often in the West as the face of the opposition. He's on Fox News a lot, lobbying Trump to bomb his country. Did you pick up any sense of what people in Tehran feel about him and his movement, which includes people at rallies in places like London, waving Israeli flags?
Okay, the the feeling on the ground in Iran is that Reza Pahlavi is a clown. It's something that I've mentioned on social media. He's actually like the running joke. From the majority of people I spoke to, they do not represent him. In fact, some people even said that even if they wanted to have change in the government, they would not choose Reza Pahlavi. So the idea that there is going to be somehow some foreign interference, foreign intervention, and the government's going to be changed, nobody can really unanimously decide on what that's going to look like. And Reza Pahlavi is, they actually make jokes about him and his family. There isn't this kind of sentiment on the ground where they support him. In fact, it was the opposite. Some of the people that I interviewed, I mean, I'd like to say this quite openly, is I'm not sure if I can say it on your platform, but he is actually a piece of shit. Like that's what they were calling him. They actually blamed him for the bloodshed. They blamed him for the riots. There were a number of people. There was Iqbal Hussein, there was Sarah, there was Imran, there was Irfan, the names that I've got listed of people that have been killed, all of their families said to me that they blame Reza Pahlavi. They were absolutely disgusted that a man who has not stepped foot in this country, in Iran, for decades, and sits on the other side of the ocean and incites violence on the very streets that these people have to live in. So they actually blamed him entirely for everything that happened. And that was quite a majority opinion within the group of people that I spoke to.
We are going to wrap. Any other comments, any other impressions of Iran that you want to share with us?
I'm actually really saddened to see that in any other political discourse, alternative perspectives are allowed. And one thing I will say is that Iran does sit as the center of the axis of resistance. Everything that is being concocted right now, to me, looks like it's for the benefit of Israel. And I mean, going to war with Iran definitely is not popular with even American citizens. And I can see that just going on my social media for 5 minutes. And it's really interesting because as a sovereign nation within that geopolitical plane, every country has a right to have ballistic missiles, have weapons for defense, not for attack. So this idea that's always propagated that Iran wants to use their nuclear program for these like nefarious reasons, it's just an excuse. It's just an excuse to target yet another country in the Middle East like they always have done. And I just wish that more people would stop buying into this format that we've seen happen for so many years, and yet we're just seeing it all over again. And it's sad because I feel like more people should be out of the stage of ignorance in the West.
I agree. I mean, I thought people should have learned the lesson from Iraq, where there was a manufactured narrative to justify an invasion, which was Iraq WMDs, shown to be a complete lie. But then we've seen in other targets of regime change, Libya, Syria, the same playbook, atrocity propaganda. This government does this, and this is why we have to go destroy the country. But yet, even though it's being deployed again with Iran, and now totally on behalf of Israel, it's not even hidden anymore that because Iran can defend itself from Israel with its ballistic missiles, those ballistic missiles have to be dismantled. A lot of people are still buying into the propaganda. And I think by going there for yourself and, being on the ground, it's really important to show people a different perspective. So thank you for coming on and sharing us what you found here on Useful Idiots.
No, thank you so much for having me. And again, I urge people once it gets better. I mean, what's also interesting is that it just feels really safe there. It just feels very, very safe there. And I know that Western government websites have like warnings on there to be careful to travel, but it was so smooth sailing for me to get there as a tourist, as an independent journalist. And there were so many other people from all different walks of life present in Tehran while I was there.
Bushra Shaikh, thank you very much.
Today we're talking about Jesse Jackson, the civil rights icon, reverend, and presidential candidate. He died on Tuesday at the age of 84. He worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He then ran for president in 1984 and 1988 when he pushed to cut the Pentagon budget while increasing domestic spending on education, housing, and healthcare. Jackson was also active in international struggles and campaigns, ranging from the anti-apartheid movement to supporting rights for Palestinians. Jesse Jackson also visited Palestine. And of course, he was criticized for his defending Palestinian rights. And to talk about Jesse Jackson, we are joined by Eric Easter, a producer, writer, and media executive and CEO of Black Box Digital Studios. He was press secretary to Reverend Jesse Jackson for the National Rainbow Coalition. We also speak to Albert McIver, who's an attorney and was the national president of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. He worked for Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign, doing outreach to the Arab American community in 1984. Thank you so much to both of you for joining.
Sure. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Can you start off by telling us how each of you knew Jesse Jackson?
My relationship was accidental. Luck, I guess I should say, as opposed to accident. But it was weird. I was in a band in college. My bandmate, Brian Tate, his mother, was formerly Marion Barry's press secretary and was one of the first staff members to join the Jackson campaign in '84 as his press secretary. Brian and I had started a business in her kitchen. I was doing media for the business. She saw what I could do. She needed an assistant. She grabbed me and said, "Hey, why don't you do this?" I had just graduated from Howard. I had no job yet. I said, fine. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And, the rest was history after that. So it was God's accident,
What about you, Albert?
Well, I guess I was equally as lucky. I had just finished law school and was hired by the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, a newly minted civil rights organization that was founded by former U.S. Senator Jim Aberisk from South Dakota. And not too long after I came, they said, okay, you're assigned to the Jesse Jackson campaign. You're going to be part of the Arab American stripe of the Rainbow Coalition. And not only was I fortunate enough to meet the Reverend, but my dear friend Eric as well.
Tell us about Jesse Jackson's political trajectory. And we're going to talk about the Rainbow Coalition, but what do you think people need to know about Jesse Jackson to understand who he came to be?
You have to go probably far back for that. I mean, he was, a college football star and head of his student body at North Carolina A&T and probably destined for the NFL had he not chosen to go into politics. I hate to step on the story of, that his family can tell much better. But he met Dr. King, was referred to Dr. King. Dr. King saw something in him. He set a new course and became sort of the youngest member of the core team of the, SCLC, working with Dr. King, and then was, sent to Chicago to really launch. And I think people miss this point of it because we talk about politics, is really set to launch the economic agenda of what Dr. King laid out, to put things into place for that, which he was hugely successful but I think not as recognized because of the, running for office and those kinds of achievements. But I think there is also a class of Black entrepreneurs, a large class of Black entrepreneurs and Wall Street executives and contractors and all kinds of folks who owe their opportunities to the work Reverend Jackson did. But I think as a faith leader, as a seminarian, as someone who studied Howard Thurman and studied, but also studied A. Philip Randolph, as a labor leader, I think he saw the connection between religion and politics and the fact that they were in some sense the same thing, that, the Bible laid out a course for revolution, not for sitting back and praying. And I think that's what drove him.
Albert, you as someone you were part of the Rainbow Coalition, can you tell us about what that Rainbow Coalition is and how it connects to this message of revolution that Eric just referred to?
Well, when I say part of it, the campaign itself was an expansion of the Rainbow Coalition. Yeah. So I joined the 84 historic campaign, and we were perfect examples because he reached out to us. nobody else would touch us. In fact, at that time, there were presidential candidates and others who were being forced to return money to donors of the Arab American community. I mean, imagine that if any other community was discriminated against like that. And like Eric said, he didn't have any lines between religion and politics. I think he used both of them to actually achieve the goals. And, the old "what would Jesus do" type of thing was there. So if it was standing up for Nelson Mandela and the apartheid system in South Africa, or the exact same thing happening in Palestine, or for the poor here, he taught us all, and he brought us on. We were neophytes. I mean, but he understood that opportunity was there. One day, actually, when I was talking to him about these huge leaders and how can we break into the system, and there's this revolving door of people, even when they get out, they get back in. And he said, "Albert, former people just get more former." And I never forgot that. So it was an opportunity for us to get in there and make change. And I think each of us in our own small way tried, and to some degree was, able to do that. But giving us that opportunity, opening that door, and being fearless because others were being persecuted for doing exactly what he did. But he didn't care. He wanted to do the right thing because his mantra was, collectively, no matter how small or big you are, we can make change. But if you just sit back, change will overcome you.
Eric, you wrote a piece at Politico, and you share a fascinating story. Can you share that for people who haven't read it?
Which anecdote? It's probably realized on a friend of mine who called yesterday, Ron Gilliard, and I hate to step on his story as well because he tells it better. But we reconnected a couple years ago. So I have to give this context, and I ran into him, and I was just saying hi. I remembered him from 30 years ago or so. And then he went on and on, to introduce me to his wife and his kids, and you're part of my story, and I, when he told the story, I had actually forgotten this because it was sort of what we did every day, but you don't realize the stuff that Reverend Jackson did every day that impacted people's lives forever. But, I met him as a college student during a student protest at Howard.
So this is Ron Gilliard you're talking about.
This is Ron Gilliard, high-ranking student there. But weeks after was arrested on false charges in PG County, mistaken identity, didn't have a close relationship with his family at the time, didn't have anybody to call, used his one phone call, happened to have my card, my Rainbow Coalition card in his pocket, called me. I answered, he just caught me at the right time, happened to be in town. And really, soon after, I passed on the information to Reverend Jackson and, made a phone call, got him out. One of those things like okay, it's done, made a phone call, it happened. But, it changed his life. He went on to become like just one of the major record executives, he's responsible for, Alicia Keys' success and other folks. And so you just never know who you're helping at the time. But it was just those small things like beyond the cameras and all of the major things that about. That is sort of the everyday stuff that he was doing. There was always someone, some community, some person, sort of desperate to have their story told or to have their story receive light or heat,
Right.
So that it could be addressed in some way. And that was the everyday thing, sort of beyond sort of his major achievements. And so that's really what I remember, how much those things were a part of our work with him, helping out just one person at a time, and that was really the lesson. I mean, it was he used to say everybody can't be great, but everyone can serve, and so that's sort of the lesson for everybody. Like you can just make one little change, and you don't realize that you're changing someone's life in a really major way.
And what were each of your roles, by the way, in the campaign?
I was deputy press secretary in '84. I was deputy communications director in '88. And then I traveled with him as his press secretary from like August of '88, just after the Democratic convention. And during that time of stumping for Mike Dukakis. And then through mid 1990 or so. So I left shortly after Mandela was released, when we were there during that time as well. Yeah.
And likewise, I came on again as a neophyte, fresh out of law school. So I was able to tour around with some of the much larger legal heads were there. But my primary role was to be a liaison to the Arab American community. So to raise consciousness, to organize, to get more and more people on the grassroots involved. And it was during that period that I actually met my beautiful wife. So that was a great fringe benefit for me.
Yeah.
But I mean, we did some amazing things with him and through him that we would have never even had a chance to do. I remember one fundraiser in New York City, Tavern on the Green, that Roberta Flack hosted. And she was like, one of my idols. My mom, when we were kids, bought a record player and 4 albums, and that was one of them. And so I'm sitting at the other end of the piano as she's playing, like pinching myself. Am I really here? And then Eric and I got invited back to her place for what we now call an after party, and continued and had a chance to sit and talk with Lionel Richie. So, all these things would have never happened. On the other hand, a lot of the other events were just, going into churches 2 or 3 hours late, and the choirs were keeping everybody there because, they needed something to keep them. And Jesse would come in. It was like, I felt like walking in with, the Beatles or some people would be screaming, yelling, fainting. But I remember one occasion, and most of them were pretty safe, but there was one in California at Casey Kasem's home. And there were
Lebanese American, for people who don't know.
Yeah. The America's top 10, America's top 40, top DJ in the world at the time. And there was all these anti-Palestinian hecklers that the Secret Service had to, keep from entering into the home. And then minutes later, they had climbed trees. It was incredible. But other than that, for the most part, I think the biggest problem was so many people just rushing to touch him, just to talk to him. He carried on that tradition of Martin Luther King. I mean, he was always too humble probably to say that, but that's what it was. He said he stood on his shoulders and then everybody else stood on Jesse's. And, unfortunately, the same day that Jesse passed, Reverend Hagler passed away, another person that was trained and inspired by Jesse and did all that work. So we should have to remember both reverends at this time.
And, the tradition that Jesse Jackson came from Martin Luther King is the tradition that doesn't get a lot of attention, especially in the mainstream historical telling of history, right? Where the tradition of, for instance, class, the importance of class and anti-militarism. And this is something that I think really stands out. And we see this in a lot of his speeches. And I mean, it's kind of incredible that he got as far as he did, given how hard it is to succeed right now. And we're talking about decades ago. Were you guys shocked by how successful he was?
I don't know. I think it was, I don't think shocked. I think it was particularly in '88, I think it was what word am I trying to use? I think it was an affirmation of what we suspected and what we thought. It's certainly an element of surprise, but also just an affirmation of the work. And it's important to remember, sort of no social media, no. The media trying to interpret, trying to go through major media mostly to interpret what he was doing. And so, he smartly, genius-like really used the Black press and other minority press to help shape his narrative and, to help reach audiences that couldn't be reached otherwise. I mean, we had a guy, Jeff, I'm trying to remember Jeff's last name, but who went around and just recorded him and then sent out, all those clips to Black radio and just ran them incessantly. And this is, of course, again, a different age when you knew the owners of the radio stations and there was a core of Black owners of, many of the top radio stations around, particularly throughout the South. Same thing with black newspapers. Or you could call the DJ and say, hey, Reverend Jackson's in town. Can he come on with you for 5 minutes? And he could put you on. He can make that decision. So prior to syndication and all those things. So, while it may have seemed outside like, hey, the New York Times is saying this and Washington Post is saying this, he was reaching in deep, deep, deep to the community in ways that were unrecognized by everyone and turning those into action and into votes. And so we knew from the field work that something was going to happen. But I think that, we all probably came in, particularly in 84. I think, is this going to work? Is it not? How long are we going to be here? I think maybe the first couple of months, was very dicey. And that was how we were treated as well, right. Particularly by the press who, and I was telling a story yesterday, the advent of a whole generation of serious Black journalists who have gone on to cover presidential campaigns. It's kind of their first presidential campaign to cover. And they were given that specifically because I think their bosses thought that it was a flash in the pan. They'll be around a month. You cover the Black guy, you're done. You've had the job. And then when it turned out to be something bigger than that, that's when you saw their integrity being questioned. Those journalists, are you really doing reporting? Why is everything good? Can you be objective if it's a Black candidate and you're a Black reporter? Just very racist, sort of questions. And so I always heard those battles. Again, technology, this was back in the day when you had to leave 2 hours in their schedule so people could call their newspapers and file and all that. And so you overheard these conversations, and a lot of those conversations before filing was these journalists arguing with their editors about whether or not they were being actually objective and, being questioned about their integrity because they were Black and they were covering a Black candidate. And eventually they turned out to be the only ones who could really understand what was going on because so much of what was happening was very deep within Black culture. The fact that the Nation of Islam, for example, registered to vote, which they hadn't done before, which you had to have some perspective of why and what that was about to really write about. You needed those Black reporters to make sense of. So that's all to say, it was a not just a political movement, it was a cultural movement as well. It was a cultural shift. And it was, exposing a people to the press as well as a candidate to the press.
I want to show some clips from his speeches. So let's take a look at this, a clip from his 1984 DNC speech. I honestly kind of can't even believe he was allowed to deliver it.
Our nation at its best feeds the hungry. Our nation at its worst will mine the harbors of Nicaragua. At its worst, will try to overthrow that government. At its worst, will cut aid to American education and increase aid to El Salvador. At its worst, our nation will have partnership with South Africa. That's a moral disgrace. It's a moral disgrace. It's a moral disgrace. There are 22 nations in the Middle East. Our nation must be able to talk and act and influence all of them. We must build upon Camp David and measure human rights by one yardstick. In that region, we have too many interests and too few friends. If we cut that military budget without cutting our defense and use that money to rebuild bridges and put steel workers back to work and use that money and provide jobs for our cities and use that money to build schools and pay teachers and educate our children and build hospitals and train doctors and train nurses, the whole nation will come running to us.
There you kind of have it. You see him talking about imperialism, talking about jobs, talking about Christianity. And of course, his understanding of Christianity and religion was a totally egalitarian one. He was not someone who only worked with Christians, right? I mean, that was the whole point of his understanding of the Bible, right? Of the prophetic tradition from which he came. It was very inclusive, internationalist, multiracial. So it is insane. I mean, watching something from 1984 where I feel like I can't believe he didn't get booed off the stage. But I also understand when I asked you guys if you were surprised, and you kind of said not really, you were affirmed. I think part of it is probably because, I mean, he's so magnificent as a speaker over the internets So I can't even imagine what it would be like, what it was like to hear him in person.
Well, you know what though? It's funny because you can go back, 20 years earlier than that and look at debates, with Malcolm X and with James Baldwin and hear stuff that is, more radical even than that, right? In terms of
Right.
its,
But they weren't the DNC.
right, but still, still in front of, primarily white audiences
Sure.
and folks and no, not at the DNC, but I think speech, that level of speech, that level of thought, I think it's been dumbed down since then. So I think we're surprised in one sense, like, man, I can't believe you said it. And that, I'm surprised that, people feel like they couldn't say that now. I think you could probably say it more then than now without, you would get canceled now. I think they're at least, he was friends with his opponents, the folks who were Democrats who were running against and those on the opposite side. And he knew those people and spoke to them all the time. And I think there was much more civility in that. We disagree, but, we're on the other side. I'm not sure you could do that now,
Right.
As opposed to then.
Look what happened to Spike Lee this week alone, right? And, you said he spoke to these issues, but really he didn't speak to them. He elucidated with power, and we just found out recently, at least I did, that the code word for him from the Secret Service was thunder. And it was thunderous, and he got thunderous applause. He may not have won the election, but he won millions of hearts and minds across the nation that never would have even voted before, which is another important thing, because the complacency, even today, maybe more so than then, just a few thousand votes here or there would have made a lot of changes in our current environment. So somehow, without the internet, we didn't even have cell phones. I mean, for your younger listeners, we had wired phones on desks with push buttons back then. So the tools are there. There's no reason why this whole project and his mantra of keep hope alive, if we do anything to honor his memory, it's to keep hope alive, but to act on it, not just speak about it, because that's what he did. He acted.
Well, it's interesting you brought up Spike Lee, and of course that he wore a hoodie that had a keffiyeh pattern on it. He got totally slammed for that. And Jesse Jackson was talking about Palestine way before it was acceptable discourse. And here's actually a clip of him on the Dick Cavett show from 1979.
After visiting the Holocaust site, the tour guide asked me, how did I feel about it? I said, one has to have a sense of tragedy. And I think it's real tragic. I said, and the phrase that many Jewish people use, never again, really should apply to everybody, because all of us should say never again to fascism. Because this is the logical conclusion of fascism. Because I read Trail of Tears. I know how the Indians were exterminated. 60 million blacks were lost between Africa and America. We must have a new formula in the Middle East that represents more balance in our policy. We must be concerned about Palestinian justice, Lebanon's territorial integrity protected, and normalized ties with the Arab world. That must not be considered offensive.
Did he ever tell you guys why Palestine was such an important issue for him? And the Middle East too. I mean, he mentions Lebanon also, but
I think it was just the notion that, injustice, anywhere is injustice everywhere. Right. I think it was really just that. And, and one of the things, someone asked me yesterday, well, why him? Why was he allowed to do this sort of international things? And I just wanted to put, that in perspective as well, is that, here we think of people as being, national or, regional or whatever. But, outside this country, I mean, Jesse Jackson was the living, walking, talking embodiment of a movement that was respected around the world. I mean, the civil rights movement, you go anywhere in the world, even now, and see protests, and they are chanting in the same cadence as they were in 1964, So he is treated as a world leader around the world. You go to another, you go to Cincinnati, take a taxi to wherever with him, maybe you're getting a limo. You go to Africa and there's a motorcade sitting there for you. Right. So, that was the difference. So on the global stage, he had that kind of moral authority and respected it in a way. And I think a lot of people were not only mad about that particular issue, but offended that someone who they did not think deserved to be on the world stage was on the world stage, and then also being effective on the world stage and being respected on the world stage. So it had all of those elements as well.
He was about one standard. The other saying was civil rights at home, human rights abroad. And it just made perfect sense. And, in the campaign headquarters, my desk butted up against the Jewish Americans for Jesse, which was next to the Native Americans for Jesse, which was, so it was real. You didn't see that, right? That wasn't on TV, but that's how it operated. And, those are some of the best memories that I had, because these are people that, again, by him allowing us in, we may never have met before or had these discussions because of the segregation in politics as well.
Right.
He incorporated all of us in it.
And what was this kind of vision, the Rainbow Coalition vision, this multiracial working class vision? What was that?
I think, obviously the phrase and the idea originated with Fred Hampton, Black Panthers, and he extended it to an organization and an infrastructure. And so it really was not just a political idea, but also an infrastructure. And as we are the two examples, right? Just two small examples of people who are still very much connected after many years of the coattails that he intentionally created. That we were not just sort of employees, but we were folks who would go on to, run for office, to launch organizations, to do our own thing, and be the next generation of folks who hopefully would turn, the ideas into infrastructure and into votes and all that. And so, but I mean, he saw the connection between, white farmers and Black labor union workers and was able to, to make them see the connections as well, which was really, truly powerful. And I think, it goes back to history. These folks were once connected, prior to, in the 1800s, 1700s. These are folks who were connected. And it was the wealthy power structure who saw, power in dividing them. And so, if anything, he was reconnecting what was a historic connection between all of these groups who whose differences were largely based on imagined differences that those who were in power were trying to make to gain political value out of it.
It was very much a family atmosphere, right? His kids were there, his wife was there, and in a way we felt as that we were not just with him, but the whole group that was part of it. And the divide and conquer that Eric talked about, his whole idea was unite and win. And very simple principles. And to this day, we still haven't gotten it. We need to work a lot harder because the disparity is much worse now, right? The middle class is evaporating and time is now. You have to come together and work together.
And, one of the only, I guess, Democratic elected officials who rallied for Jackson was Bernie Sanders. And then Jesse Jackson, of course, supported Sanders' campaigns. Did you guys ever come across Sanders while working for Jackson? And what are your thoughts on that relationship?
I did. I mean, I remember, and so of course, you're not thinking it's Bernie Sanders at the time because he became Bernie Sanders, writ large later. But I remember seeing his name on the list. When the campaign went to Vermont, who's the key contact, who's the key organizer, and that was in Bernie Sanders there. Oddly enough, Stephen King also in Maine, which was that was odd to me, and that, but you just never knew. So and so he was an early supporter and a delegate for Reverend Jackson.
I think it's interesting to look as you played that clip, Katie, of the '84 convention. The joy on the faces of the delegates and the people in that room. They weren't all Jesse delegates, but it was pure joy and something that we need again. We need that hope. We really do.
Well, any final words for this interview? Because you guys have been so generous with your time, and I know you're both busy. But anything else you want to add that you want to make sure people know about Jesse Jackson or his movement or his vision?
I would just double down on Albert and our friendship and how that's indicative. My friends were, I had maybe one white guy in my band, and I went to Howard. I went to an all-black high school for the most part. Grew up in the projects in Baltimore. We worked together in many ways after the campaign was over, and still are. We're on the same boards, and I put him on my board, and I've done protested for been the only black guy protesting for anti-Arab protests, and we are indicative of the idea that he was trying to create, that folks should meet one another, work together, talk across differences, build friendships no matter what how you may differ other ways. You just need to talk to one another, and we've been lifelong friends, our families as well, because of that. And I think that's the lesson. I mean, that's that was the mission, and that was the achievement. One of many, of course.
And we have to thank you, because your vision, your opportunity continues to help us get these words out. I mean, people like you and Amy Goodman, you're our heroes, our sheroes.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much to each of you, to both of you, for coming on. And we'd love to talk to you again about all sorts of things.
Thank you so much.
So 2 great interviews from 3 great guests. What a great show it was.
Thank you for tuning in to Useful Idiots. If you want to support us, keep the show going, we're at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.